Chapter-1, The Sage of Arunachala. There is a profound truth in us, the truth of ourselves, the practical knowledge of which will make us free. But he that would be free must seek and reverently question one that is himself free. So says the ancient lore in the Bhagavad Gita. Thus it emphasizes the need to resort to a living teacher of the truth, of the real self, if one such can be found. The knowledge that comes by the study of the sacred lore is of little value. One can learn more and more quickly from this silence of a living teacher than he can gather by a lifetime of the study of books. We are told by the great teacher Sri Ramakrishna Paramahansa that there are two kinds of sages, namely those who are born with the mission to teach and elevate other men, and those who have no such mission. The first kind, born with the mission, are from birth untainted by worldly desires. They win the state of deliverance about the time they cease to be boys, and they do so with little or no effort. And the latter are born in subjection to worldly desires and weaknesses, and have to go through a long period of sustained and well-directed effort in order to reach the same goal. The first kind of sage is naturally very rare. Whenever such a one appears, multitudes of disciples and devotees are drawn to him, and they profit greatly in his presence. Bhagavan Sri Ramana is such a one. He is the last of a long line of great sages who have renewed and confirmed the teaching of the ancient revelation. He was born in the south of India in the village of Tiruthuzi, about 30 miles from Madurai, and received the name Venkataraman. His father died when he was 12 years old, and after that he was brought up by his mother and uncles. The boy was sent for education, first to Dindigul and then to Madurai, which is a great center of pilgrimage. His guardians had no suspicion of what he was destined to become. They tried their best to fashion him after their own idea of what he should become. They sought to equip him for the life of the world by giving him a good education. The boy was not at all wanting in intelligence, but he was incorrigibly indifferent to his studies. He would put forth no personal effort to learn and remember. Insofar as he did learn something, he did so in spite of himself. The reason was that he had no will to get on in the world, which every boy has, who is above the average. We now know that he was one of those rare beings who bring with them an endowment of spirituality. That perfection which was to make him the revered master of millions of men existed in him already in a latent state. And it is the law of nature that a spiritual endowment makes one indifferent to worldly gains. It is because the average man is poorly endowed in a spiritual sense that he falls as easy prey to worldly desires. Urged by these desires, he takes great pains to achieve what he calls success in life. We know that Sri Ramakrishna also had an incorrigible aversion to this bread-winning education. Thus the boy Ramana gained hardly any knowledge while at school, but destiny put in his hands a copy of an ancient sacred book in Tamil, which gives detailed narratives of the 63 saints of Shiva. He read it through with fervor. We have reason to believe that he had already been a saint of the same high degree of excellence and had passed this stage of spiritual evolution. He had in him the potentiality of something far higher, namely the status of a sage. When we come to the chapter on devotion, we shall be able to see the difference between a saint and a sage. For the present, we need only say that the sage differs from the saint as the ripe fruit does from the flower. Saintliness is no more than the promise of sagehood, which alone is perfection. When Jesus told his disciples, "Be ye perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect," he had in mind the sage, not the saint. Even as a little boy, Ramana was continually aware of something supremely holy, whose name was Arunachala. This we learn from a poem composed by the sage later for the use of his disciples. We see that he brought over from his past lives a fully ripe devotion to that mysterious being, which most of us call God, but which may be more justly described as the spiritual center of life. This was seen on one occasion in his boyhood, when an uncle of his spoke to him harshly. He then went for consolation and peace, not to his earthly mother, but to the divine mother in the temple of the village. Sometimes also he would fall into what seemed to be an exceptionally profound sleep, a sleep from which nothing could awaken him. If we may judge from the perfection which he attained later, and which he enjoys in the waking state also, we may surmise that this seeming sleep was in fact a spiritual experience on an elevated plane of being. Thus continued his life, a double life on parallel lines, a life in the world which he led mechanically and without interest, as one that did not really belong to the world, and a life in the spirit, of which the people around him had not even the faintest suspicion. This lasted till the end of the 16th year of his life. He was then in the highest class in the high school course, and it was expected that at the end of the course he would sit for the matriculation examination at the University of Madras. But this was not to be, for then something happened which brought the boy's schooling to an abrupt end. The age period of 16 and 17 is a critical one for all. In the average man, the mind is then overrun by imaginations and desires which revolve round the sense of sex. But for a few exceptional souls, it is the time of the awakening to the true life, compared to which this thing that we call life is death, the life that begins with the blossoming of the spiritual perfections, which are already latent in them. This we find to be the case in the lives of all the saints and sages of the world. It is also a fact, appearing in the lives of the sages of the past, that this awakening begins as a rule with a sudden fear of death. It is true that the fear of death is not unfamiliar to common men, for it comes often enough to them. But there is a difference in the reaction to this fear. To the common man, it makes very little difference. He is led to think of death when he sees a funeral procession. Sometimes he begins to philosophize, more or less on traditional lines. But this mood lasts only until his next meal. Afterwards he becomes so-called normal again. The current of his life runs on the same lines as before. The born sage reacts differently to the thought of death. He begins to reflect coolly, but with all the force of his intelligence, on the problem of death. And this reflection is the starting point of a concentrated effort to transcend the realm of death. Thus it was in the case of Gautama Buddha, because Buddha really means sage, and the sage was called Sugata, which means one that has attained the state of deliverance. And it was also the case with Ramana. Thus Ramana reflected, "Who or what is it that dies? It is this visible body that dies. The kinsmen come and take it away, and it is burnt to ashes. But when this body dies, shall I also die? That depends on what I really am. If I be this body, then when it dies, I also would die. But if I be not this, then I would survive." Then there arose in his mind an overpowering desire to find out then and there whether he, the real self of him, would survive after death. And it occurred to him that the surest way to find out would be to enact the process of death. This he did by imagining that the body was dead. A dead body does not speak nor breathe, nor has it any sensation. All this he imagined with such perfect realism that his body became inert and rigid, just like a corpse. His vital energies were withdrawn from it and gathered into the mind, which now turned inwards, animated by the will to find the real self, if such a thing did truly exist eternally. At this moment, a mysterious power rose up from the innermost core of his being and took complete possession of the whole mind and life. By that power, he, that is to say, his mind and life, was taken inwards. What then happened is a mystery, but we can gather some idea of it from the teachings of the sage himself. We must take it that, possessed by this power, which is identical with what devotees call grace, the mind plunged deep into the source of all life and mind and was merged in it. All this happened while he was wide awake, and therefore he became aware of his real self, free from all thought movement. This self was free from the bondage of desires and fears, and therefore full of peace and happiness. The state which he now reached was just the egoless state described in a later chapter, the state in which the real self reigns alone and in serene calmness. Thus Ramana became a sage. We shall never know what that state is like until we ourselves shall reach it and abide in it. But with the help of his revelation, we shall be able to understand what it is not.